So good evening, everyone. So Wilkinson Eyre, we're an architectural practice. So we're based in central London, but we work internationally, and we probably work across a wider range of sectors than most. And we bring a lot of those thoughts and that knowledge and skill from lots of other sectors into this project, which is very much a project that is made up of many different parts, as is suggested here. I can't pretend that I have the sort of lineage that Robert has in this industry, but certainly architecturally we're very well known as a firm, and we've won many awards, and we have a passion for what we do and aim to do the best, and this is very much what we want to bring into this project. Could I have the next slide, please? I think this is yours, is it, Robert?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to. These we had before, so we could skip forward to your slides.
Sorry. So I'm just going to talk about some of what we're trying to bring within our design and what we're trying to bring into the buildings. And as I said, we won our commission to work on this through an architectural competition. So we brought many of our ideas into this. And what we've done over the last 3 or 4 months working with the team is to take those ideas forwards into starting looking at developing the buildings. So the buildings themselves are very much looking to create a creative environment. And, you know, they're very much collaborative spaces. They're not necessarily like normal workspaces, office spaces, but they're very much buildings where, you know, people are encouraged to be creative, where, you know, the ideas of films, they're not only office buildings that sort of do administration things, but also they're at the heart of the development and the ideas. And these buildings and building here, the opportunity to create something really special, to really integrate it with the architecture, intensive use of green roofs, renewables with PV cells generating our own energy on site, but also creating an environment to encourage a lot more biodiversity than you'd normally get on buildings. And we will also be looking at a very high sustainability agenda, a lot of low energy themes within the buildings, both passive forms of those, and also not only the buildings themselves, but very much the spaces around the buildings, and looking to create an environment that people really want to go and work in. Next. So there are a number of components in the buildings. It's almost like a town. There are a myriad of different type of buildings. One of the key ones are the workshops, where there's an enormous skill set in and around Buckinghamshire, based around film, and in those workshops there's everything from scenery made, sets made, costumes, and as you see here, elements, you know, painted, pulled together. And these are very much the sort of a feed into what goes into other aspects of the development. Next. So those workshops are often integrated with offices, and there'll be multi-storied buildings. On the lower levels, there will be sort of machine shops with timber working. And then on the upper levels, there'll be other spaces that are more like studio spaces, designing, building models, building maybe armor, maybe, you know, costumes and like, and these are all developed on site. So they're bringing skills in from outside and developed on site for the film stages and the sets. So the buildings and the architecture are very much looking to the local vernacular, probably a much greater use of pitch roofs and breaking up the forms on these buildings. And as I've talked about, you know, the outside spaces are very much spaces in some areas where there will be shooting outside, but also spaces that people want to sort of spill out of. So there's an extensive landscaping program that we'll be doing in and around the buildings to make them a pleasant environment to be in and around. Next. And those workshops, as I was saying, we're driving, you know, the site offers the opportunity to have very low energy buildings, but adopting a very sort of low, high sustainability, great use of natural ventilation, extensive daylighting, and wanting to bring into these buildings, making very much creative spaces. Extensive use of rainwater harvesting where we can on the flat roofs. We will hold water on those, and then we will use that water in and around the development for both watering the landscape, but also grey water for toilets and the like. So we're looking for the development to be, you know, very sustainable across the development as a whole. Next. And then another aspect here is the office space. There will be some office space more familiar to what you know, but a lot of the office space is very much about more like studio, creative spaces. Next. And how that will sort of manifest itself is creating very flexible spaces, light, airy, sort of studio type spaces, but again, trying to create environments that are encouraging creativity. But our brief is very much to sort of explore the opportunities for low energy, targeting low embodied carbon within these buildings, making them very sustainable and very environmentally sound. Next. So the key parts of these development, in which the workshops and the offices very much feed, are the sound stages. And these are very much where the films are shot and made. So as you see here within this environment, you can see large open space with stage sets set in them. Next. And all those sort of things like scenery, costumes, and all those elements are developed in the buildings in and around the sound stages. And the sound stages are sort of a very sort of a particular environments. They're environments that have a good volume in them, but the key thing is that they don't let light in, that they are very good acoustically, don't let sound break out, but more importantly, don't let noise break in. And these are very much where most of the activity will take place. And they will be very, very efficient buildings, very low energy. As I say, large flat roofs that we can put large areas of planting, large areas of PVs on, and so that they're very sustainable themselves. Next. And you know, the key aspect of them is that we, you know, need to drive vehicles into them. They'll have a playful and imaginative cladding to them, and where possible, we're looking to integrate planting onto those buildings to help those buildings blend into the landscape and break down their scale. Next. So another component is what's called the backlots, referred to, and these are outside spaces, and these are very much sort of temporary spaces that where things can't be shot within a soundstage, they are set up for larger scenes, as you see here on the backlot. So there are a number of open areas in and around the buildings and on those parts of the site that don't make sense for putting buildings on, or don't, you know, due to flooding and the like, and that are well shielded by existing planting. And they're very much an area that, you know, these outside scenes can be shot on. Next. And integrated with that and around that, you know, there will be opportunities to create sort of public access, access to the water's edge, and they're well screened by the existing planting. And what we'll be looking to do is not clear planting, but to enhance it. Next. And on the development itself, there are other key buildings within the development that are feed and support the community that are going to work there. Next. So that involves things like the entrance area. We're looking at a sort of key mobility hub. We're looking at very low energy systems of transport across the site, an extensive encouragement of people to cycle and the facilities for encouraging them to do that, changing, safe storage, showers, extensive use of electric mopeds and cars, so extensive charging points and the like. And so it's very much looking to be a sort of a sustainable transport plan that both works for people getting to the site, but also across the site itself. Next. We will also have slightly higher, greater hierarchy buildings that might be set up as sort of headquarters for a production as it goes on, but also for the management company that will run the development. And within those buildings, we will have screening rooms, the potential for have screening events and other events for people to come from the public to come and view things. And this around it will have a sort of a whole program of extensive sort of food and beverage cafes and things to encourage activity and you know, that ambition for, being the great, best studio that people would want to come and work in. Next. I'm going to hand it over to Jason Pryor, who's going to talk a bit about the landscapes in and around the development and the strategies for that.
Thanks, Oliver. Good evening, everyone. So I just want to do a quick overview of the landscape components of the project and sort of the glue in the system, as it were. So on the first slide, I think what we want to capture is this idea that the landscape we are creating is both the vehicle for creating the sustainable site models. It's what encompasses all of our buildings, drives our ecology, contains our drainage systems, is the thing that creates the environment that people want to be in. And of course, there has to be a clear and deliberate response to the existing landscape structure and how we engage with that. So our intent is, as it were, to draw the landscape structure that exists on the project site into the scheme, to replicate our indigenous plant species, to look at deepening the ecological value of the site, to handle things like water on the surface in ponds and rain gardens, and to ensure that we take full use of available space. So as Oliver said in that bottom left image, can we put landscape on roofs, and can we incorporate that in layers of different responses around resilience with things like photovoltaics. So just to look at some of those components a bit more detail. The next slide talks about this pedestrian network and green streets. As you saw in one of the images that Oliver showed, that response to landscape in terms of how we sit in the broader landscape, of course, speaks to also the work environment that we're trying to create, the place environment. So we're looking to put a strong landscape structure into the project. We're looking to create very deliberate cycling and pedestrian networks within the project site itself, and those connect to, as it were, the outside world. And there's a section on the right there that starts to talk to, as it were, responding to both existing tree structures and landscape structures that we want running through the project. So that looks at Westhorpe House Lane, which would remain on its current alignment, but be, as it were, embraced by a stronger landscape structure. Within the project site itself, on the next slide, we've got components that sort of switch backwards and forwards in terms of their use. So in those flex areas, we're looking to both the quality of the space that we create, but also ensuring that things like street landscapes and the containing landscape structures work well with those spaces that also need to be very flexible for the filmmaking process. So a unit base is where effectively the stars' caravans get parked, as it were, during filming, but critically during the setup phase is where lots of making and collecting the materials takes place to move into the sound stages. So these have to be flexible spaces, but we think within that we can also bring a strong landscape containment structure. Oliver's touched on the backlots. The backlots are interesting. They're simple open spaces, so we can do many things with them. They're not in continuous use. They're used at certain times of the year, used for certain times of filming. So of course they can be worked in balance with our broader landscape strategy, our broader ecology strategy, and of course they're available to do other things with. So an idea of, as it were, repurposing those spaces when not in a filmmaking program for wider public access or to be a contributing part of the wider public realm. And we're still working through what that balance looks like. We've of course been concerned and of course considering the sort of relationship between our open space system and sort of the enhanced access to the broader countryside. So on the next slide, and as we I think discussed in previous meetings, we've done a lot of work on the existing ecology. We've had watermans and their teams, as it were, monitoring the ecological value of the site through the seasons. We've mapped that. I think we understand it pretty well. And that, of course, gives us a base condition in terms of our biodiversity targets, gives us a base condition in terms of course, critical ecological habitats. And of course, it tells us in many ways how we link those habitats together to get some sort of cumulative benefits. So we're working with those ecological structures. We're taking, of course, due cognizance of plant material, habitats, and of course we've got quite a variety here between recent woodland that's been created and has grown up over time, scrub vegetation, bits of open grassland, and of course some very important water margin areas. So with those, we're looking to take those existing habitats and places and enhance them. Now, some of them are sensitive, some of them don't require people to be, as it were, walking all over them, so they need to be handled in a particular way, and that habitat protected. In other areas, of course, in this location, we want to encourage public access. We want to work with the existing patterns of public access and recreation that go on around those areas. So particularly around the water bodies, there's both the recreational aspects of it, there's the ecological aspects of it, and how do we bring those two things together? And there's important things going on in ecology on the one hand, fishing on the other, that general enjoyment of place, bird life, etc. So we're looking at that balance between the pressures on the water edges and the water bodies themselves. Within the broader sort of landscape structure we've got on the land that we're controlling, we're looking, as it were, to ensure that there is permanent infrastructure and permanent activity. And what we mean by that is improving paths, enhancing cycle facilities, making certain that there are elements within that broader landscape that people want to use to encourage recreation, to enable sports activity through these areas. We fully realize we're part of a bigger story in terms of landscape, and we'll get to, as it were, how we join all of that up as part of both what we're proposing and wider demands across the designated country park area. We're looking on the next slide to, we're thinking through and looking to a potential cultural facility. We're looking at areas south of, on the southern ends of our land holdings, and we're balancing up at the moment the provision of a public facility that is both about your understanding and access to the country park on the one hand, but also a cultural destination in terms of public gathering, events, get a cup of coffee, experience a broader environment. And we're working through that program as we speak. Temporary activities, of course, are part of some thoughts we're putting into an overlay. So if we create these public realm areas, if we create these sort of cultural destinations, what else can we put around that? And that's, of course, going to have to be a product of a broader conversation with community actors in terms of what is needed, and can we find that link, as it were, between the place we're creating, the industry we're creating, and the natural sort of cultural affinities that go with that. Said earlier, we've done a lot on the ecological studies, done full tree surveys of the site. I think we have a good idea about the sort of hierarchy of values and opportunities with existing vegetation, how best to enhance those. And that sort of base condition, as we said in previous meetings, is now being fed into our thinking in terms of how we lay the site out. And of course, there are patterns associated with that which respond to the length that land has been undisturbed, and also there's sort of quite large areas of very little or no tree cover, which kind of reflect more recent tipping activity of the past decade or so. And then finally, just a couple of slides on sort of edge conditions. And so as we kind of work our way around the project site, we look at edge, we look at how we, as it were, respond to this issue of both greenbelt setting and adjacency to the AONB. How do we create strong landscape structure, primarily from indigenous species? How do we retain things like, and there was a question I think Verity raised a few weeks ago about the poplars on the north side of the site, and currently to date we're pretty confident on we should be able to work with and maintain that line of trees. So we're looking to how existing vegetation plays to our need, as it were, to contain the site and strengthen that landscape structure. If we look on the next slide, we're looking at both landscape structure and our surface water management. So we're very much of the opinion that and it's sort of good ecological and resilience principles. Can you handle your surface water on the surface? That gives you the opportunity for ponds, ephemeral water bodies, a different vegetation and ecological structures. So that's our approach, as it were, in terms of how we manage surface water. That takes up land, but on the other hand, it gives us a really strong landscape structure. So that's what that slide's looking at. And then just a realization, just as an example, you know, we've got footpaths, cycleways running through the site. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we're looking at where existing footpaths might pass, as it were, between buildings, what level changes might look like, how do we create, as it were, a strong landscape structure around those routes, and how do we, as it were, ensure those routes are wide enough to do things like handle both pedestrians and cyclists and dog walkers all at the same time. So a sort of playbook, I suppose, of landscape responses, ecological responses, both in terms of our design response, species catalogues, needs within the landscape, both ours and community, and seeing how those fuse together is what's driving our thought process at the moment. Steve, back to you.